Cheddar Man, the face that changed British history. Scientists found a complete human skeleton buried deep inside a cave in Somerset, England, in 1903, and for almost a century they assumed they already knew what the man had looked like. They were wrong. Gough's cave is a limestone cavern carved by an underground river in the Cheddar Gorge, a narrow, dramatic ravine cut through the Mendip Hills of southwest England. It is a place of constant low temperature and high humidity, and those conditions, combined with the mineral-rich alkaline soil, had preserved the bones of a young man in extraordinary condition for approximately 10,000 years. The skeleton was found by workers during excavation to extend tourist access to the cave system. It was not a controlled archaeological dig. The bones were collected without full documentation of their precise position, and eventually passed to the Natural History Museum in London, where they were formally studied and given a name: Cheddar Man, after the location of the discovery. Analysis established that the individual had been male, had died somewhere in his mid-20s, and had lived approximately 10,000 years ago, during the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, the era immediately following the last great ice age in Britain. What the scientists of 1903 were certain of, certain enough to state plainly in their published accounts, was that this man, as the earliest known inhabitant of what would become Britain, must have looked like the people who lived in Britain now. Pale skin, brown eyes, the conventional European appearance that the phrase "ancient Britain" conjured in the popular imagination. That assumption would stand, largely unchallenged, for 115 years. In 2018, a drilling technique no wider than a pencil entered the densest part of Cheddar Man's skull, extracted a fragment of bone the size of a pea, and the assumption collapsed entirely. Archaeological records found across the British Isles and northern Europe paint a detailed picture of what life looked like for the people who inhabited this landscape 10,000 years ago, and it was a world almost unrecognizable from the one that followed. Britain in 8000 BCE was not an island. The land that is now beneath the southern North Sea, a submerged territory that geologists call Doggerland, connected what we now call England to the European continent in a broad, flat plain of river valleys, forests, and coastal wetlands. The English Channel did not exist. A person living where Gough's cave sits could, in theory, have walked to what is now the Netherlands without crossing open water. The people who lived in this landscape were hunter-gatherers. They did not farm. They did not build permanent structures in any form that has survived. They moved in small groups, following seasonal patterns that tracked the animals they hunted and the plant foods they collected. They were highly mobile and extraordinarily skilled in the practical knowledge required to live without any of the infrastructure that later periods took for granted. The diet reconstructed from sites of this period in Britain included red deer, wild boar, various birds, freshwater fish, and a wide range of gathered plant foods, roots, berries, seeds. The isotope analysis of bones from Gough's cave specifically shows a dietary signature consistent with this pattern, with a notable contribution from aquatic food sources. Their tools were made from flint, knapped to razor edges that could skin an animal, process a hide, or shape wood and bone with precision. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that these tools, made without any metal, performed many practical tasks as effectively as modern equivalents. This was not a primitive world. It was a different kind of sophisticated world, one built on knowledge and mobility rather than permanent settlement and stored surplus. Cheddar Man was part of a population that had successfully colonized post-glacial Britain. He had skills and knowledge that kept him alive in a landscape that would defeat most modern people within days. Scientists found, in 2018, that a fragment of bone inside Cheddar Man's inner ear had preserved enough ancient DNA to sequence his entire genome, and the results of that sequencing became one of the most widely discussed scientific findings in the history of British archaeology. The petrous bone, the dense, pyramid-shaped section of the skull that houses the inner ear, is the single best-preserved location for ancient DNA in the human body. Its density protects the genetic material from the environmental degradation that destroys DNA in most other bones over time. Researchers from the Natural History Museum in London and University College London used a drilling technique to extract a small sample from Cheddar Man's petrous bone without damaging the visible structure of the skull. The sample was processed using ancient DNA sequencing technology developed over the preceding decade specifically to reconstruct degraded genetic material from archaeological remains. The resulting genome was of sufficient quality to make confident predictions about a range of physical characteristics. The findings, published in 2018 alongside a presentation at the Natural History Museum, were unambiguous on several points. Cheddar Man had blue eyes. The specific genetic variants associated with blue eye pigmentation were clearly present, the same variants that produce blue eyes in modern European populations. He had dark, curly hair, and his skin was dark, genetically consistent with a pigmentation level significantly darker than any modern British population. The man whose bones had been described for over a century as the ancestor of the British people had dark skin, blue eyes, and curly dark hair. The pale-skinned figure that had represented ancient Britain in museum displays across the country was the product not of evidence, but of assumption. The researchers noted that predicting skin color from ancient DNA carries some uncertainty. The gene variants involved in pigmentation are numerous and interact in complex ways. But the direction was clear, and the confidence interval placed Cheddar Man firmly outside the range of modern British or Northern European skin tones. Genetic researchers found, when they examined the Cheddar Man data in the context of the wider ancient DNA record from prehistoric Europe, that light skin pigmentation in British and Northern European populations was not an ancient feature. It was a relatively recent biological development. The common assumption, rarely examined critically before the ancient DNA revolution, was that European populations had always been light-skinned. This assumption was so embedded in popular and scientific thinking that the pale reconstructions of ancient Europeans were produced without any direct evidence to support them. They simply looked the way people expected ancient Europeans to look. The genetic record tells a different story. The variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation in modern European populations appear to have spread significantly through Northern Europe only within the last 6,000 years, associated with two major population movements: the arrival of early farming populations from Anatolia and the later expansion of pastoralists from the Eurasian steppe. The biological logic is straightforward. Skin pigmentation is a trade-off. Darker skin provides better protection against ultraviolet radiation, reducing the risk of skin damage and certain cancers. Lighter skin allows more UV radiation to penetrate, which increases the production of vitamin D, critical for bone health and immune function in environments where sunlight is weak and seasonal. For populations whose diet included abundant vitamin D from fish and other animal sources, as hunter-gatherer diets typically did, the selective pressure toward lighter skin was reduced. When farming populations shifted to grain-based diets lower in vitamin D, the pressure toward lighter skin in low sunlight environments increased significantly. Cheddar Man's dark skin in this context is not anomalous. It is what the genetic record predicts for a British hunter-gatherer of his era. The anomaly was the assumption that it could have been otherwise. Archaeologists found, at the same site where Cheddar Man's bones were discovered, evidence of practices by the people who lived there that took decades of careful analysis to interpret, and that revealed a relationship with death quite unlike anything modern Western culture would recognize. The bones found in Gough's cave include not only Cheddar Man's relatively intact skeleton, but also a substantial quantity of fragmentary human bone representing multiple individuals. Analysis of this material, published in research spanning from the 1980s through the 2010s, identified a consistent pattern across the fragments. The cut marks on the human bones were methodical and purposeful, consistent with the processing of a body to separate soft tissue from bone. The marks appeared in locations and with techniques identical to those used on the animal bones found at the same site. Bones from horses, aurochs, and red deer that were clearly being processed for food. Additional analysis identified human skull fragments that had been carefully shaped, the facial bones removed, the edges smoothed, into objects that researchers interpret as drinking vessels. This practice, known from other prehistoric sites across Europe, appears to have been deliberate and skilled rather than incidental. Whether the individuals processed in this way were members of the same community who had died and were being incorporated into ritual practice, or whether they represented enemies or outsiders, is a question the archaeology cannot definitively answer. Both interpretations have been argued in the published literature. What is clear is that the people of Gough's cave had a structured and intentional relationship with human remains, one that involved the careful transformation of the dead into objects that continued to exist among the living. This was not disorder. It was, by the evidence available, a form of practice. Cheddar Man himself was not processed in this way. His skeleton was largely intact when found. He was, in some sense, treated differently from the other individuals whose remains appear at the site. DNA researchers found, in 1997, more than 20 years before the full genome sequencing, that a living person in the village of Cheddar shared a direct maternal lineage with the 10,000-year-old man found in the cave above the town. The 1997 study was conducted as part of a television documentary and involved collecting DNA samples from volunteers in the Cheddar area, people with family connections to the region going back multiple generations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed directly from mother to child without recombination, was extracted from Cheddar Man's remains and compared against the local samples. One match was identified. Adrian Target, a history teacher at the local secondary school whose family had roots in Somerset. His mitochondrial DNA matched the sequence from Cheddar Man closely enough to indicate a shared maternal ancestor. A direct line of descent, through the female line, spanning approximately 300 generations and 10,000 years. Target's response became one of the most quoted reactions in British science journalism. He expressed genuine surprise, not at the connection itself, which he found intellectually fascinating, but at what the 2018 genome sequencing would later reveal about what that ancestor had actually looked like. The 10,000-year-old man he had been matched to looked nothing like the image he had seen in school textbooks. The continuity of the lineage across 10 millennia in the same geographic area is remarkable. It indicates that the hunter-gatherer populations of Mesolithic Britain were not simply replaced wholesale when farming populations arrived from the continent around 6,000 years ago. Some of them, or at least their maternal lineages, persisted and blended into the incoming population, leaving a genetic trace that remained detectable 100 centuries later in the DNA of a schoolteacher in Somerset. Research subsequent to the Target discovery estimated that approximately 10% of the modern British population carries genetic ancestry traceable to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations of which Cheddar Man was a member. Forensic analysis found, when researchers examined Cheddar Man's skeleton in detail, a body that had been physically capable in ways that set it apart from modern human anatomy, and that showed the wear and stress of a life lived entirely without the infrastructure that most people in later periods took for granted. The bones of the legs and feet showed pronounced development of the muscle attachment sites, the points where tendons connect muscle to bone. The specific pattern of bone stress and remodeling observed was consistent with a lifetime of sustained walking and running over varied terrain, beginning in childhood. This was not the skeleton of someone who sat for long periods or used vehicles of any kind. Every journey had been made on foot. The teeth showed evidence of significant wear and use. Dental analysis of Mesolithic individuals consistently reveals that the teeth were used as tools for processing hides, softening sinew, holding objects, in addition to their primary function in eating. The dietary abrasion pattern on Cheddar Man's teeth was consistent with a diet high in fibrous plant material and meat processed without cooking vessels. The skull trauma that was identified at discovery remains ambiguous in its interpretation. The damage is located on the frontal bone and could be consistent with a blow delivered during life, with a fall, or with post-mortem damage from the weight of sediment over thousands of years. Without soft tissue evidence or other contextual information, the cause cannot be established. His age at death, the mid-20s, was not unusual for this period. Life expectancy in Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations was constrained not by any single cause, but by the cumulative risks of a physically demanding existence: injury, infection, seasonal food stress, and the absence of any medical intervention beyond whatever practical knowledge the community possessed. He was, by all the evidence, a physically capable and well-adapted individual who died young in a world where dying young was common. Forensic artists found, when they began the technical process of building a physical reconstruction of Cheddar Man's face in 2018, that they were working at the intersection of two disciplines that had rarely been combined at this level of precision: forensic facial reconstruction and ancient genomics. The Kennis brothers, Dutch paleoartists Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, who specialize in the physical reconstruction of prehistoric humans, and whose work has appeared in museum installations across Europe, were commissioned by the Natural History Museum to create a full-body model of Cheddar Man. The process began with high-resolution 3D scanning of the original skull, producing a digital model accurate to fractions of a millimeter. From the digital skull, standard forensic facial reconstruction techniques were applied, building up estimated muscle and soft tissue layers using established anatomical reference points, with the depth and structure of each layer guided by population data about facial musculature in individuals with similar skeletal characteristics. The genomic data was incorporated directly into the surface appearance. The specific variants identified in Cheddar Man's DNA, those associated with skin pigmentation, eye color, and hair texture, guided the final aesthetic choices: dark skin, blue eyes, dark curly hair. The completed model was unveiled at the Natural History Museum in February 2018, simultaneously with the publication of the scientific paper. The image, a confident, dark-skinned face with striking pale blue eyes, was broadcast around the world within hours and became one of the most widely shared scientific images of that year. The face was, for many viewers, genuinely unexpected, not because the science was unclear, but because the assumption it replaced had been so deeply embedded in how Britain visualized its own ancient past. The reconstruction did not change what Cheddar Man had looked like. It simply showed, for the first time, what he had actually looked like, and that was enough to make headlines on every continent. Journalists and researchers found, in the weeks and months following the 2018 publication, that the response to Cheddar Man's genome results divided almost entirely along lines that had nothing to do with the science itself, and that the findings had touched something in public discourse that went far beyond archaeology. In the United Kingdom, media coverage was largely positive and engaged seriously with the scientific content. Publications from The Guardian to the BBC ran detailed explanations of the methodology and the implications for understanding British prehistory. Museum attendance at the Natural History Museum increased measurably in the period following the announcement. In the United States and Canada, the story was picked up primarily within discussions of race, identity, and the politics of national origin. The finding that the earliest known inhabitant of Britain had dark skin was used in arguments about the instability of racial categories and the constructed nature of ethnic identity, arguments that the science itself supports, though researchers were careful not to allow the genomic findings to be reduced to simple political talking points. In Germany, Norway, and other northern European countries, with their own politically charged discussions about indigenous identity and immigration, the reaction was more mixed. Some commentators engaged thoughtfully with the evolutionary biology. Others dismissed the findings on ideological grounds, arguing that the DNA results were misrepresented or misapplied. A segment of online commentary across all markets rejected the findings entirely, claiming that the study had been conducted or presented with a political agenda. The researchers responded by pointing to the methodology, which was identical to that used in dozens of other ancient DNA studies that had not attracted the same controversy, and by noting that the genomic data was independently verifiable by any laboratory with access to the relevant sequencing technology. The genome does not have an agenda. It records what it records. DNA scientists found, in the full accounting of what Cheddar Man's genome revealed, something that extended far beyond the specific details of one individual's appearance. A demonstration that the story of who has always belonged in a place is rarely as simple as the story that place tells about itself. The 10% figure, the estimated proportion of modern British people who carry Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry from populations like Cheddar Man's, is a finding with real implications for how the concept of indigenous is understood in a British context. The people who were in Britain before the farmers arrived were not replaced. They were partially absorbed. Their DNA persists. It is present in people alive today, including people whose families have been in the same area for generations. And those people, the ones most directly descended from the hunter-gatherers, are descended from individuals who, the genomic evidence now shows, had dark skin. The genetic feature most often used, historically and in contemporary political discourse, to mark the boundary between indigenous and foreign in a British context, turns out, on examination, to be itself a relatively recent arrival. Adrian Targett, the schoolteacher whose 1997 DNA match to Cheddar Man made headlines worldwide, continued to live and work in Somerset after the 2018 revelation about what his ancient ancestor had looked like. His response to the updated picture was, by his own account, one of simple interest. The connection he had already known about for 20 years, the genetic thread running from a man in a cave 10,000 years ago to a man teaching history in the same county, was what mattered to him. The bones in Gough's cave have been there for 10,000 years. The genome within them has been readable for only a few years. The questions it raises about identity, about belonging, about the stories we tell ourselves about where we come from, those questions are not resolved by the science. But the science does insist they be asked honestly.